Something was wrong with Australia, not the Australia that exists today with its familiar coastlines and sunburned plains, but the Australia that existed 120 million years ago, when the rules that governed life on every other continent simply did not apply here. This was a place where the largest predators on Earth were not at the top, where darkness swallowed the land for weeks at a time, where shallow seas rose and swallowed entire habitats without warning, and where evolution took directions that scientists are still struggling to fully explain. This was not simply a strange corner of the ancient world. It was a place that actively defied the patterns seen everywhere else, producing ecosystems, creatures, and survival strategies that had no real equivalent on any other landmass. To understand why, we have to go back further than most people imagine, back to a time when Australia was not an island at all, when it sat pressed against other continents in the deep south of the world, locked in darkness for months at a time, flooded by inland seas that came and went without warning, and ruled by predators that should not have existed in the form they took. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching this history video and what time you're watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Tonight, we are going back to that world. We are going to walk through every layer of it, from the ground shifting beneath ancient feet to the sky filled with creatures that blurred the line between flight and nightmare. We are going to understand not just what lived here, but why this place produced something that nowhere else on Earth managed to create. The story of ancient Australia is not simply a catalogue of strange animals. It is the story of what happens when a landscape itself becomes the architect of life, when isolation, darkness, flooding, and relentless pressure combine to push evolution into territory it had never explored before. To begin that story, we have to start with the land itself, because the land was the first force that shaped everything else. Long before its familiar outline took shape, the landmass that would become Australia was not a separate place. It was a quiet interior portion of something far larger, a continuous expanse of joined continents stretching across the southern half of the planet, in a configuration that feels almost impossible to visualize from the present. This ancient supercontinent known as Gondwana held within its borders what would eventually become South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia, all pressed together in a slow and shifting arrangement that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years. There were no oceans separating these regions. Life could move across them without interruption, following pathways that stretched for thousands of kilometers without a single body of water to block the way. Within this arrangement, the portion of Gondwana that would become Australia sat far to the south, closer to the pole than it rests today. This positioning was not incidental. It was the first and most fundamental force that would define everything about how life developed here. Latitude shapes light, and light shapes everything else. In the deep south, the sun did not follow the same reliable arc that it traces across equatorial skies. Instead, it moved in long, shallow paths that stretched across summer horizons for weeks before retreating entirely during the polar winter. This meant that the land experienced extended periods of continuous daylight followed by prolonged stretches of near-total darkness, a pattern that had no parallel in the warmer regions where most of the ancient world's largest ecosystems were developing. This was not Antarctica as we understand it today, locked beneath permanent ice and stripped of complex life. The Cretaceous world was warmer across all latitudes, and even these southern regions remained free from the ice sheets that would later define polar environments. Temperatures here were cool but not frozen, and the land supported genuine forests, genuine ecosystems, genuine diversity. Yet the light was wrong in ways that created pressures unlike anything experienced further north. Plants that depended on photosynthesis had to manage through months of minimal sunlight. Animals that depended on those plants had to find ways to endure intervals when food production slowed or stopped. Predators that depended on both had to adapt their behavior to conditions where visibility itself became unreliable for extended periods. The result was an ecosystem shaped from its earliest development by a rhythm that forced compromise. Every organism that survived here had already been selected for a degree of resilience that organisms in more equatorial environments simply did not need. The southern position was not just a geographical fact. It was an evolutionary filter, and it had been filtering life here for millions of years before the Cretaceous period began to express its most remarkable chapter. As the Cretaceous progressed, the arrangement of Gondwana began to change. The immense plates of the Earth's surface, never truly still, began shifting in ways that slowly stretched the connections between these southern landmasses. This was not a sudden splitting or a visible fracture. It was a process measured in millions of years, where distances grew by centimeters per year, accumulating across time into separations that eventually became oceans. The pathways that had allowed life to move freely across the southern world began to narrow. Routes that had once been continuous land became increasingly interrupted by shallow marine expanses, then by deeper water that could no longer be crossed. Populations that had shared common ancestry across vast distances began to find themselves confined to smaller and smaller regions, cut off from the genetic exchange that had previously connected them to the broader world. For the landmass that would become Australia, this separation carried profound consequences. As it began to drift away from Antarctica and from the broader Gondwanan mass, it took with it the life that was already present, the species that had already been shaped by southern conditions, already filtered by darkness and seasonal extremes, already adapted to a world that demanded more of its inhabitants than most regions required. These organisms now found themselves on a slowly separating island continent, carrying their unique heritage with them into increasing isolation. The drift itself was not the only force reshaping the land. Beneath the surface, the geological processes that drive continental movement also influence the height and configuration of the ground above. As the plate carrying this landmass shifted, regions that had once been elevated began to subside, and the relationship between the land's surface and sea level began to change in ways that would transform the interior of the continent into something few people today would recognize. During the Cretaceous, global sea levels were significantly higher than they are today. The warmth of the period meant that no substantial polar ice sheets existed, and the volume of water in the world's oceans was distributed differently. When this elevated sea level encountered a landmass where interior regions were subsiding, the result was predictable and dramatic. Water moved inland. Not in a single catastrophic flood, but in a gradual and persistent encroachment that, over millions of years, converted vast stretches of the Australian interior into something that did not resemble land at all. Shallow seas spread across the continent's interior regions, covering areas that had previously supported terrestrial life and replacing them with broad, gently sloping marine environments that stretched for hundreds of kilometers from the original coastlines. These were not the deep, cold oceans that surround the continent today. They were warm, shallow, and biologically rich, filled with life that took advantage of the nutrients carried into them and the stable temperatures maintained by a warmer global climate. Marine reptiles moved through their waters. Ancient relatives of modern fish populated their depths, and along their edges, where water met land in shifting boundaries, entirely different forms of life gathered at the intersection between two worlds. The presence of these inland seas did something to the Australian continent that would prove enormously significant for everything that followed. It broke the land apart. Where once there had been continuous stretches of habitable terrain, the advancing water created islands, peninsulas, and isolated patches of elevated ground separated from one another by varying depths of warm water. Life that had been able to move freely across broad areas now found itself confined to smaller regions, unable to cross the water barriers that had appeared between previously connected habitats. This fragmentation had immediate and long-term effects. In the short term, it concentrated populations into smaller areas, increasing the intensity of competition for resources that were now distributed across a reduced landmass. Animals that had previously been able to spread across large territories to reduce competition with one another now occupied the same restricted spaces, forced into closer and more frequent interaction. In the longer term, it accelerated the divergence of populations from one another, as groups separated by water could no longer interbreed, leading their respective lineages down increasingly distinct evolutionary paths. But the inland seas were not permanent. They rose and fell over millions of years in response to changing conditions, and their retreat was as significant as their advance. When sea levels dropped and water withdrew from the interior, it left behind landscapes shaped by its passage, flat sedimentary plains rich in the nutrients deposited by marine organisms, exposed terrain that had been altered by prolonged submersion, and new habitats that opened up where water had previously excluded terrestrial life. These retreating seas created opportunities, but they also exposed the organisms that had adapted to the fragmented landscape to new conditions and new pressures, requiring further adjustment. The combination of these forces, the southern position that created seasonal darkness, the gradual separation from Gondwana that isolated the landmass, and the repeated advance and retreat of inland seas that fragmented and reorganized the available habitat, created a foundation unlike anything found elsewhere on Earth. This was not simply a different continent. It was a different kind of place, one where the rules governing the development and distribution of life had been shaped by a unique combination of pressures applied over an enormous span of time. The climate that settled over this ancient Australian landscape reflected all of these influences. The global warmth of the Cretaceous period moderated temperatures even at high southern latitudes, preventing the extreme cold that might otherwise have made this region uninhabitable. But the warmth was not uniform. The position of the continent, its relationship to ocean currents, and the configuration of the land itself all created patterns of rainfall and temperature that varied significantly across different regions and across different times of year. Some areas received consistent precipitation that supported dense, continuous vegetation. Others experienced more variable conditions where plant communities could shift or diminish as the patterns of moisture changed. This climatic variability added another layer of instability to an already dynamic environment. Habitats were not static features of the landscape but living communities that responded to changes in rainfall, temperature, and the physical configuration of the land. A region that supported dense forest under one set of conditions might shift toward more open vegetation as moisture patterns changed, altering the resources available to every animal that depended on it. These shifts did not occur instantly, but they were persistent, accumulating over time in ways that required constant adjustment from the organisms living through them. For the ecosystems developing on this fragmenting, flooding, darkening continent, the result was an environment defined by impermanence, counted on to remain as it was. The land might flood, the light might disappear for weeks. The vegetation that had supported a population might diminish as rainfall patterns shifted. In such an environment, the organisms that could persist were those that carried the capacity for adaptation not as an occasional response to unusual circumstances, but as a continuous and fundamental aspect of their existence. This is where the story of ancient Australian life truly begins, not with specific animals or dramatic encounters, but with the recognition that the environment itself was the primary force shaping everything. Understanding what lived here and what made this place so different from the rest of the ancient world requires understanding the world that produced it, a world of shifting seas, seasonal darkness, fragmenting habitats, and relentless pressure applied across millions of years to every living thing that called this place home. The ground beneath ancient Australia was never still in the way that firm and reliable Earth allows us to imagine. Even setting aside the deep geological processes of plate movement, the surface itself existed in a state of perpetual negotiation between land and water. The inland seas that spread across the continental interior were not fixed bodies with stable coastlines. They were dynamic systems whose boundaries shifted in response to the same forces that had created them, responding to fluctuations in global sea level, changes in regional subsidence, and the continuous redistribution of sediment that altered the depth and extent of their shallow waters. In some geological intervals, these seas expanded significantly, pushing their margins further into areas that had recently been dry. In others, they contracted, pulling back from regions that had briefly been submerged and exposing new stretches of land that had not seen sunlight in thousands of years. These fluctuations created a coastline that was never fixed, a constantly moving boundary between the terrestrial and marine worlds that shaped the distribution of life along its shifting edge. For organisms living near these margins, the advancing and retreating water represented both opportunity and threat. When seas expanded, habitats were lost, populations were displaced, and animals were forced to move toward higher ground where resources might already be fully occupied by established communities. Competition intensified as displaced organisms arrived in areas that had not previously been pressed by their presence. The carrying capacity of remaining terrestrial habitats was tested as more life was concentrated into less space. When seas retreated, the opportunity existed to recolonize newly exposed terrain, but this terrain was not immediately hospitable. Land that had been submerged for extended periods required time to develop the soil structure and vegetation communities that could support complex terrestrial ecosystems. The organisms best positioned to take advantage of newly exposed ground were those most capable of operating within impoverished environments, those that could establish themselves quickly and make use of limited resources while more complex communities were still developing. This cycle of advance and retreat created a landscape that was perpetually in various stages of ecological development. Mature, complex ecosystems existed alongside pioneer communities just beginning to establish themselves on newly exposed ground. The interactions between organisms from these different ecological stages added further complexity to a system already characterized by instability. The sediment deposited by these retreating seas left behind a record that scientists would eventually use to reconstruct the story of this ancient world. Layers of fine-grained material, the accumulated remains of marine organisms, and the preserved traces of life that had lived along these shifting margins all settled into sequences that captured different moments in the long oscillation of water across the continental interior. Within these layers, the bones of animals that had lived beside these seas were occasionally preserved, carried into depositional environments where the conditions favored their survival across millions of years. These fossil deposits became some of the most important sources of information about what life in ancient Australia looked like. The bones they contained, along with the teeth marks, growth patterns, and physical characteristics preserved within them, provided direct evidence of the animals that had inhabited this world. But they also carried indirect evidence about the conditions under which those animals had lived, the environments they had occupied, and the pressures that had shaped them. The vegetation that covered the terrestrial portions of this ancient landscape was itself a product of the unusual conditions that prevailed here. Plants growing in a region with pronounced seasonal light variation faced challenges that their counterparts in more equatorial regions did not encounter. The extended periods of reduced sunlight during polar winter required strategies for managing reduced photosynthesis, storing energy accumulated during productive seasons, and maintaining structural integrity through intervals when the energy budget was constrained. Ferns covered much of the ground's surface in dense, overlapping layers that held moisture close to the soil and created complex microhabitats beneath their fronds. These ancient plants, well established long before the Cretaceous, thrived in the conditions that prevailed here, their tolerance for variable light and moisture making them particularly well suited to an environment that did not offer consistent conditions. They formed the foundational layer of many plant communities, creating a living carpet across the landscape that supported a range of smaller animals and provided cover that larger species used for concealment. Above this ground layer, conifers rose with steady, persistent forms. Their needle-like leaves, adapted to manage reduced water loss and to remain functional across a range of conditions, gave them an advantage in the seasonally variable environment of southern Gondwana. These trees did not grow with the same rapid exuberance as tropical forests. They grew more deliberately, accumulating mass and height across longer intervals, their growth rings potentially recording the seasonal variation in light and moisture that characterized each year. The forests they formed were not the dense, closed canopies of equatorial regions, but more open structures where light reached the ground more consistently, supporting the fern communities below. Cycads added another element to this plant community, their heavy crowns and sturdy trunks marking them as survivors from an even earlier period of Earth's history. These ancient plants had persisted through multiple episodes of global change, and their presence in the Cretaceous Australian landscape reflected their remarkable capacity for endurance. They grew slowly, accumulated nutrients efficiently, and maintained themselves through conditions that might stress faster-growing species. For herbivores capable of processing their tough, chemically defended tissues, they represented a persistent and reliable, if challenging, food source. The earliest flowering plants were beginning to appear during this period, their presence still limited but their potential already evident in the range of environments they were beginning to colonize. These newcomers did not yet dominate the landscape, but they introduced variety into the plant communities, offering different textures, nutritional profiles, and structural forms that gradually expanded the possibilities for the animals that fed upon them. Their ability to reproduce and spread more rapidly than the older plant lineages gave them an advantage in disturbed environments, particularly in the areas repeatedly exposed and inundated by the advancing and retreating seas. For the herbivores that depended on these plant communities, the structure of the vegetation was not simply a backdrop to their existence. It defined the boundaries of their world, where plants grew densely, feeding was possible but movement was constrained. Where vegetation opened into more sparse arrangements, movement was freer but exposure increased and the quality of available food might be reduced. The seasonal variation in plant growth created periods of relative abundance followed by periods of scarcity, requiring herbivores to either store energy internally, migrate to regions where growth continued, or simply endure reduced intake until conditions improved. These challenges were not unique to ancient Australia, but they were expressed here with particular intensity, given the pronounced seasonality of the light regime and the instability of habitat boundaries created by the fluctuating seas. The result was a community of plant-eating animals that had been shaped by more demanding conditions than those faced by their counterparts elsewhere, animals that carried within their biology the marks of long exposure to an environment that did not offer consistent abundance. Understanding how these animals moved through their world requires understanding not just what they ate, but how the distribution of food shaped their behavior across different scales of time and space. Day to day, herbivores had to locate sufficient plant material to meet their energetic needs while managing the exposure that feeding inevitably created. Week to week, they responded to the availability of different plant types as some flourished and others diminished in different microhabitats. Season to season, they adjusted their position across the landscape to follow the shifting availability of productive vegetation, moving away from areas where growth had slowed and toward regions where it continued. These movements created patterns that extended across the landscape, connecting different habitats through the predictable travel of large animal populations. These patterns were not invisible to the predators that depended on them. They were instead the fundamental organizing structure of the predatory world, the underlying logic that determined where hunting opportunities could be found and how predators should position themselves within the landscape to take advantage of them. The relationship between plant communities, herbivore populations, and predator behavior formed an interconnected web that was sensitive to disruption at any point. A shift in rainfall that reduced plant productivity in one area would cause herbivores to move, which would require predators to adjust their own positioning, which would alter the competitive dynamics between different predatory species, which might influence which prey species were most heavily targeted, which could feed back into changes in herbivore population structure and movement. These feedback loops operated continuously, making the ecosystem a dynamic and responsive system rather than a static arrangement of fixed relationships. Within this web of interactions, some relationships were more direct than others, but none were truly isolated. The movement of water across the landscape influenced the distribution of plants. The distribution of plants shaped the movement of herbivores. The movement of herbivores defined the opportunities available to predators. And the behavior of predators influenced how herbivores used the landscape, closing a cycle that connected every element of the ecosystem to every other through pathways that might span the entire extent of the available habitat. What made ancient Australia distinctive was not the existence of these relationships, which are features of all ecosystems, but the intensity with which they operated. The fragmentation of the landscape into smaller patches by the inland seas compressed these interactions into reduced spaces. The seasonal extremes imposed by the southern latitude intensified the periodic scarcity that drove competition. The isolation from other continental regions prevented the dilution of local pressures by the influx of species from elsewhere. All of these forces combined to create an environment where the fundamental ecological relationships that govern life everywhere else were expressed with unusual force and consequence. Among the most remarkable features of ancient Australian ecology was what paleontologists have come to describe as an inverted predator hierarchy, a situation where the usual order of ecological dominance was reversed in ways that had no clear parallel anywhere else in the Cretaceous world. To appreciate how unusual this was, it is necessary to understand what was happening elsewhere during the same period. Across most of the Cretaceous world, a particular group of large carnivorous dinosaurs dominated the predator guild in the way that lions dominate African savannas today, not as the only predators present, but as the apex figures around which the rest of the ecological hierarchy organized itself. These were the carcharodontosaurids, enormous theropod dinosaurs that reached sizes comparable to Tyrannosaurus rex, with massive skulls, serrated teeth designed to deliver devastating wounds, and bodies built for overwhelming large prey through sheer physical force. In North America, South America, Africa, and Europe, these giants or their equivalents occupied the uppermost position in the food chain, the organisms that all other predators ultimately deferred to. In Australia, the situation was different in ways that continue to provoke scientific debate. The carcharodontosaurids were present, but they appear to have occupied a secondary position within the predatory hierarchy rather than the dominant role they held elsewhere. Something else was at the top. The evidence for this reversal comes from multiple lines of analysis, including the relative size of predatory animals recovered from Australian fossil sites, the patterns of interaction preserved in fossilized bone, and the broader ecological context suggested by the distribution of prey species and habitats. What occupied that apex position was a group of dinosaurs that were themselves extraordinary, representatives of a lineage that combined physical power with anatomical features, suggesting a style of predation quite different from the straightforward pursuit and bite strategies of the largest theropods. These animals carried large, strongly curved claws on their forelimbs, structures that appear designed not simply for striking prey from a distance, but for maintaining grip through close physical engagement. The biomechanical implications of these claws suggest a predator that operated differently from the giants that dominated elsewhere, one that relied on proximity, grappling, and sustained physical contact rather than the application of a single overwhelming bite. The bodies of these animals reflected this predatory approach in multiple ways. Their musculature was arranged to support powerful pulling motions with the forelimbs, allowing them to draw prey toward their bodies and maintain that contact against resistance. Their hind limbs provided a stable base for these engagements, and their overall body proportions suggested animals capable of sustained physical effort rather than brief explosive attacks. This was not a predator designed to knock down prey with a single strike and then step back. It was designed to hold on, to maintain engagement, to apply continuous force until the outcome was resolved. The presence of these animals at the apex of the Australian predatory hierarchy, in a position occupied elsewhere by much larger animals that operated very differently, raises profound questions about why this particular approach to predation proved so successful in this particular environment. Part of the answer may lie in the structure of the habitat itself. The fragmented, vegetation-rich landscapes created by the combination of inland seas and seasonally variable plant communities may have favored ambush and close contact predation over the open pursuit strategies that worked well in more expansive environments. A predator that could maintain a grip on struggling prey in dense vegetation, in narrow corridors between water bodies, in the constrained spaces of a fragmented landscape, had advantages that would not have been as significant in the open plains where the largest carcharodontosaurids thrived. The prey available in ancient Australia also differed from that found in many other Cretaceous ecosystems. The isolation of the continent meant that the herbivore community had developed its own distinctive character, shaped by the same pressures of fragmentation and seasonal extremity that had influenced every other aspect of the ecosystem. The animals available as prey in this environment were not necessarily the same sizes and types as those found in more northern regions, and predators that had evolved in response to local prey communities would reflect those specific conditions. Understanding the full picture of the Australian predatory world requires looking beyond just the largest carnivores to the entire network of predatory organisms that occupied different levels of the ecosystem. Large theropods, whether of the apex or secondary variety, shared the landscape with smaller carnivores that occupied their own distinct roles within the hierarchy. These smaller predators did not simply exist as lesser versions of the giants above them. They operated within their own ecological space, targeting prey that was inaccessible to larger animals, using habitats and movement strategies that would have been impractical for the biggest carnivores, and competing with one another for resources in ways that created their own complex dynamics. Among these smaller predators, animals that combined speed, agility, and sensory acuity played roles that complemented rather than duplicated those of the larger carnivores. They moved through the denser vegetation more easily, could pursue prey through terrain that would slow larger animals, and could exploit food sources that the apex predators would not bother with. Their presence added layers to the predatory community, creating a system where different sizes and styles of predator occupied different spaces within the broader ecological structure. The interactions between these different levels of the predatory hierarchy were themselves significant forces in shaping the system. Smaller predators had to manage their activities in relation to the larger animals that might take their prey or, in some circumstances, view them as prey themselves. Larger predators needed to be aware of the competitive dynamics that smaller carnivores represented, particularly in relation to access to carcasses and the maintenance of territory. These overlapping pressures created a complex web of relationships within the predatory community that extended well beyond the simple linear hierarchy suggested by size alone. Evidence of these interactions appears in the fossil record in the form of bite marks on bones that tell stories about who was feeding on what and in what sequence. The marks left by teeth of different sizes and shapes on the same bones reveal that multiple predators of different species engaged with the same carcasses, sometimes in overlapping timeframes. The patterns of these marks suggest not just sequential feeding by different species after the dominant predator had finished, but active competition and displacement, with different animals attempting to access the same resource at the same time. In some cases, the marks on bones suggest that predators were feeding on other predators, indicating that the line between hunter and hunted was not always as clear as simple hierarchy might suggest. A large predator weakened by injury or old age could become a target for smaller carnivores opportunistically taking advantage of a reversed situation. The fossil record captures these moments without judgment, preserving in mineral form the evidence of a system where roles could shift and where no animal's position was permanently secured. The presence of healed injuries on predator bones adds another dimension to this story. Bones that show fractures, puncture wounds, or other trauma that subsequently healed indicate that the animals carrying these injuries survived encounters significant enough to leave physical evidence. These survivors carried within their bones a record of conflict that had not ended their lives but had marked them permanently. The frequency with which such injuries appear in the fossil record of predatory animals suggests that direct physical conflict between predators, whether of the same species competing for territory or of different species competing for resources, was a regular feature of life in this environment rather than an exceptional event. The relationship between predators and their environment extended beyond the simple question of what they hunted. It encompassed the full range of ways in which large, active carnivores interact with the physical landscape and with every other species that shares it. Predators do not just remove prey from the system. They shape the behavior of every organism that lives within the range of their influence, altering where herbivores feed, how long they stay in any given location, what routes they travel, and how their populations are distributed across the landscape. These behavioral effects, which ecologists call the landscape of fear, can be as significant as the direct effects of predation itself. An animal that avoids a productive feeding area because of predator presence loses access to those resources whether or not it is ever actually attacked. Populations that cluster together for safety spend more time monitoring for threats and less time feeding, potentially affecting their body condition and reproductive success. The indirect effects of predator presence ripple through the entire ecosystem, influencing every species that must adjust its behavior to account for the risk of being eaten. In the fragmented landscape of ancient Australia, these effects would have been particularly pronounced. The constrained habitat patches created by the inland seas meant that predators and prey were already operating in closer proximity than they might have been in more expansive environments. The behavioral adjustments that prey animals made in response to predator presence had to be implemented within smaller spaces, with fewer options for simply moving away from areas of high risk. The result was a more intense and continuous influence of predator behavior on the entire community. Herbivores responded to this pressure in ways that left their own marks on the fossil record and on the broader ecological structure. The tendency to form groups, which provides protection through shared vigilance and the dilution of individual risk, appears to have been a significant behavioral strategy for many of the large plant-eating animals of this period. Moving and feeding in groups did not eliminate the risk of predation, but it distributed that risk across multiple individuals and allowed the group collectively to maintain a higher level of awareness than any single animal could achieve alone. The structure of these groups was not random. Individuals within them occupied different positions based on their size, age, and condition, with more vulnerable animals tending toward the center where they were buffered by the bodies of others, and larger, more capable individuals at the periphery where the first contact with approaching predators was most likely. This spatial organization within groups represented a sophisticated response to predatory pressure, allowing the collective to function more effectively than the sum of its individual members. The movement patterns of herbivore groups across the landscape reflected the combined influence of resource distribution and predator avoidance. The need to find sufficient food pulled groups toward areas of productive vegetation, while the need to avoid predators pushed them away from areas where predators were likely to be present. The resulting movement patterns were the product of these competing pressures, tracing paths through the landscape that balanced access to food with management of predatory risk. In a fragmented landscape with multiple overlapping predator territories, finding routes that satisfied both requirements was a complex challenge. Areas of productive vegetation might coincide with areas of high predator activity, particularly if predators had learned to position themselves where prey was predictably concentrated. The most dangerous places in the landscape might be precisely the places where food was most abundant, forcing herbivores into a continuous negotiation between starvation and predation. The inland seas themselves played a role in this dynamic. Their edges represented zones where terrestrial animals needed to approach to drink, creating predictable gathering points that predators could exploit. The shallow margins of these water bodies also supported their own communities of organisms, some of which represented additional predatory threats to animals approaching from the land. The shoreline was simultaneously a necessary destination and one of the most dangerous locations in the landscape, a convergence of needs and risks that shaped how every terrestrial animal related to the water boundaries of their fragmented world. Marine predators that moved through the shallow inland seas added a dimension to the predatory landscape that had no equivalent in fully terrestrial environments. Large plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs moved through waters that extended into the heart of the continent, their presence felt along every shoreline that marked the boundary between their world and the terrestrial world above. Animals approaching the water to drink entered a zone where threats could emerge from below without warning, where the visual cues that allowed detection of terrestrial predators were useless, and where the physical advantages of size and speed that might provide some protection on land offered little benefit. The intersection of these multiple predatory pressures, terrestrial apex predators, secondary carnivores, and marine hunters all operating within the same fragmented and compressed landscape, created a system of extraordinary complexity. Every animal in this world existed within a web of influences that extended from the ground beneath its feet to the waters beside it and the sky above it, with threats that could materialize from any direction and that required constant management of behavior and position. The sky above ancient Australia was not empty. Pterosaurs of various sizes moved through the air above this landscape, adding yet another dimension to the predatory web that permeated every level of the environment. These flying reptiles ranged from small, agile forms capable of quick maneuvering through complex terrain to larger species with wingspans that allowed them to travel considerable distances on thermal currents rising from the warm land below. From their elevated position, pterosaurs had access to a perspective on the landscape that no terrestrial animal could match. They could observe the movement of animals across open ground, tracking the patterns of herbivore groups, monitoring the positions of larger predators, and identifying the locations of food resources that might not be visible from ground level. This aerial vantage was not passive observation, but an active component of their predatory strategy, allowing them to locate opportunity across a wider area than any ground-bound hunter could survey. The descent from that vantage to a target on the ground was rapid and difficult to anticipate from below. An animal occupied with feeding or moving through terrain that limited its upward visibility might have little warning before an aerial predator closed the distance from considerable height. The shadow cast by large pterosaurs approaching from above might provide a moment of warning, but in terrain with variable light conditions, even that signal could be unreliable. The presence of aerial predators added an upward dimension to the awareness that ground-dwelling animals needed to maintain. In addition to monitoring the terrestrial environment for approaching predators and the water margins for marine threats, animals in this landscape also needed to attend to the sky, a demand that, when combined with the other vigilance requirements imposed by a complex predatory environment, created a substantial ongoing cognitive load. The time and energy devoted to threat monitoring was time and energy not available for feeding, resting, or reproduction, representing a real cost imposed by the density of predatory pressure in this environment. For smaller animals, pterosaurs represented an immediate and significant threat. Animals below a certain size were physically manageable targets for even mid-sized pterosaurs, and the aerial approach meant that the usual defensive strategies of group living and terrain use were less effective. Being within a group helped if the group collectively detected the approaching predator in time to respond, but an individual separated from its group, or in a position where the aerial approach was masked by terrain or light conditions, faced a very different situation. The pterosaurs themselves were not immune to the pressures of this environment. They occupied a predatory niche, but also existed within the broader competitive and physical context of the landscape. Their eggs and young were vulnerable to ground predators, and the sites they chose for nesting needed to balance accessibility with security. The demands of flight required high caloric intake, making them dependent on reliable food sources and sensitive to changes in prey availability. The coastal and shoreline environments that marked the boundaries of the inland seas were particularly important for certain pterosaur species, providing access to aquatic prey that supplemented their terrestrial hunting. Shallow water that exposed the bodies of fish or other aquatic organisms to a predator approaching from above represented an opportunity that pterosaurs with appropriate anatomical specializations could exploit efficiently. The convergence of terrestrial, marine, and aerial food chains along these coastal zones created environments of extraordinary ecological richness and complexity. The interactions between pterosaurs and the terrestrial predators below them were another aspect of this complex web. Large terrestrial carnivores and large pterosaurs occupied overlapping ecological space in some respects, both targeting animals in a range of sizes, and their presence in the same landscape created conditions where direct competition or opportunistic interactions might occur. A large pterosaur descending to feed on a terrestrial carcass might find itself in proximity to a carnivorous dinosaur with its own interest in the same resource. The outcome of such encounters would depend on the relative sizes and capabilities of the individuals involved, and the history of such interactions would have shaped how both pterosaurs and terrestrial predators behaved when they found themselves in proximity. Against this backdrop of layered predatory pressure, fragmented habitat, and seasonal environmental extremes, the biological processes that sustain populations across generations unfolded with their own urgent rhythm. Reproduction in this environment was not a leisurely activity, but a critical priority shaped by the need to replace individuals lost to predation, environmental fluctuation, and competition before those losses accumulated to the point where population viability was threatened. The nesting behavior of dinosaurs in ancient Australia reflected these pressures. Eggs represented the most vulnerable point in the reproductive cycle, immobile concentrations of parental investment that required both physical protection from predators and appropriate environmental conditions to develop successfully. Choosing a suitable nesting location was consequently one of the most significant decisions an animal could make, with implications for the survival of offspring that extended far beyond the moment of egg laying. The seasonal light regime of this southern landscape introduced complexities into nesting timing that did not apply in more equatorial regions. The extended periods of reduced light during the polar winter affected temperatures and the activity levels of both parents and potential nest predators, creating a temporal structure to reproductive opportunity that animals in more stable light environments did not need to navigate. Timing reproduction to take advantage of the most favorable conditions while avoiding the worst required biological systems tuned to the specific rhythms of this place. Evidence from related dinosaur species and from the broader Mesozoic record suggests that many dinosaurs exhibited some degree of parental behavior toward their nests and young, remaining near nesting sites to guard against predators or to provide warmth. In an environment with the level of predatory pressure seen in ancient Australia, such behavior would have had clear survival value. A nest guarded by a parent represented a very different target for a potential predator than an unguarded one, and the decision to approach such a nest required weighing the risk of confronting the parent against the nutritional value of the eggs. The growth rates of young dinosaurs after hatching were themselves a product of evolutionary pressure in high-risk environments. Species that grew quickly from the vulnerable small size of hatchlings to a larger size where they were no longer accessible to the full range of predators had a survival advantage over those that grew more slowly. The fossil record captures evidence of this through the structure of bone tissue, which preserves growth patterns in a way that allows paleontologists to estimate how quickly different species added mass during their development. In many Cretaceous dinosaur lineages, growth rates were significantly faster than those seen in living reptiles of comparable body plan, reflecting the evolutionary premium placed on moving through the vulnerable juvenile phase as quickly as possible. Even with rapid growth, the period between hatching and reaching a size that provided meaningful protection from predators was a time of extraordinary vulnerability. Juvenile dinosaurs occupied a different ecological niche than their parents, small enough to be targeted by predators that could not threaten adults, limited in their mobility and behavioral repertoire relative to mature individuals, and dependent on finding sufficient food to fuel the rapid growth their survival required. The mortality rate among juveniles was undoubtedly high, and the reproductive strategies of their parents were shaped in part by the expectation of these losses. The interplay between reproductive investment, juvenile vulnerability, and the broader predatory environment created a population dynamic that reflected the intense pressures of the ecosystem. High rates of juvenile mortality required high rates of